So we're going to switch gears a little bit. We were talking about infrastructure as a service, and in the last section, talking about Kubernetes containers. In this section, we're going to be talking about web apps. Now, web apps have a lot in common with containers. Essentially, you're going to create and package your code on your local machine, and then you're going to publish that code or upload that code into your web app service. And Microsoft Azure is going to take care of running the web app. It's in control of the infrastructure. You do not have remote access into that. There's no SSH or RDP into a web app. And in fact, you don't have a lot of insights into the hardware itself. Now, you should keep in mind that Microsoft is probably sharing the hardware between yourself and other clients in a tenant scenario. And so there's a reason why you don't have access to the underlying stuff of web apps. There is an isolated version of web apps, and we'll talk about that coming up in this video. Now, Azure web apps are sometimes called Azure App Services. When you're using either term, you're basically referring to the same thing. Sometimes people will talk about API apps or mobile apps. Well, those are also app services, and in fact, there's no perceivable difference between a web app, a mobile app, and an API app. So those are all the same thing. They have different names and different icons, but they're all Azure App Services. There's also the ability to run Azure Functions as a web app or inside of an app service. So besides the web app, mobile app, and API app, you also have a type of function that can run. Now, functions are also a serverless model, so when you're setting up your functions, you can choose between them. But we're going to talk about app service model in this section. Now, web apps are a little bit different than containers in that they only support a set of languages. So for instance, the Azure App Service supports .NET, the classic, .NET Core, which is their new open source version of .NET, Java, Ruby, Node.js, PHP, or Python. If you need applications that do not are not any of these, you're probably going to have to use infrastructure as a service so that you can control the environment. Okay. Now, there is going to be a difference between choosing Windows web apps and Linux web apps. For instance, Linux web apps do not support .NET Classic. They only support .NET Core for obvious reasons. Let's switch over to the interface and we can go through the process of creating a web app and demonstrate this. Now, on the Azure portal, you can go up to the Create a Resource, the green plus, and hit it. And you'll see web apps listed as one of the most popular options. It's right now number 3 on that screen that comes up from when you put the plus sign. You can also find them under the web option, and you can see their web apps for containers, logic apps, and API apps, and etc. Like I mentioned earlier, API app is just a web app with a different name and a different icon. So let's choose web app. Now, web apps are public by default, and so they're going to be given a fully qualified domain name, and whatever name you choose has to be unique across all of Azure. So this AZSJD new app that I chose is unique across all of Azure. Now, don't worry about this if you don't like this URL. You can always register your own domain name in the traditional way and use the domain name service to map that domain into the web app, and we'll look in the settings of this app service on how to set up a custom domain name. You choose your subscription. Now, everyone's subscription might be a little different. You might have the free plan, you might have the enterprise plan, or your company has its own unique plan, MSDN accounts, etc. So mine's the pay-as-you-go option. I'm going to create the resources for this web app in its own resource group. I like to separate out things, makes it easier to delete after and to clean up. Now, this is where I said we have the option between operating systems. For Windows, you can see that it supports application insights. If I switch over to Linux, it does not, and in fact, Linux forces you to choose the underlying runtime stack as part of this, okay, part of setting up the service. For Windows, you don't have to make that choice. You can upload different types of apps, and you can deal with that in the settings. Application Insights, the reason why that's Windows only is because it allows you to surface data that only your application might know to the portal for other purposes. So this ties in with your application using an SDK, and you can basically get your application to report back to the portal on specific information, and then you can monitor on that, trigger on that, or use that for scaling purposes, etc. So we're going to create a classic Windows operating system web app, and we do have the choice between code, which means that we're going to develop it using a tool such as Visual Studio or Visual Code, and then we're going to publish that or upload that into the application directly. Docker image, very similar to what we were dealing with the Kubernetes service. That means that you're going to push this to a Docker Hub or ACR, and we can then do deployments based on Docker images, not based on direct code being pushed. Now, this concept of the app service plan, perhaps this is a pretty important concept. The app service plan is very similar to a hosting plan. So just like when you want to set up your own website, you go to a hosting company and then you sign up for a service. They have different tiers and different options depending on how much you want to pay. Microsoft Azure has this hosting plan. Now you can have multiple web apps running in the same hosting plan. To understand the different pricing options, we can go to the Microsoft website again, and we can see the different options. We haven't got into it yet, but I'll talk about them in a second. But we can see that there are some limitations to the number of apps. There are 10 limit on the free plan and 100 limit on the shared plan. But after that, you can actually deploy an unlimited number of applications into the same app service plan, subject to the other limits. So subject to the disk-based limit, or subject to basically those apps needing performance compared to the other apps in the same plan. Okay, so 10, 100, and then unlimited after that. Let's go back to here. We're going to create a brand new app service plan for this web app, and I'm going to call it AZSJD New Plan. Now, this name does not need to be unique across all of Azure, but it does need to be unique in terms of your region. And I obviously have an app service plan with the same name in the central US region. So I'm going to call it 2 Classic. But I don't even want to put it in central US region. I'm going to put this host into the East US region. The implication of choosing the location essentially is performance related. Your app should be closest to the users who are going to use it to reduce the latency, the amount of distance that the data has to travel between the users and the application. If your application is global, then you want to choose a location that makes sense to you. Now let's look at the different tiers. Now I already alluded in the pricing to the fact that there are free, shared, and other tiers. So Microsoft splits this out between dev, test, production, and isolated as the 3 major categories. And under there are many different pricing tiers. Okay, we got the F tier, the D tier, the B tier, and so on. We're going to pause the video, and in the next video, we're going to review each of the options for the pricing tiers.